Hello economics students, now that you have mastered the balance of payments, we're going to look at two broad influences on Australia's current account. So we're not thinking about the CAFA in this video. There are two different causes for changes in the current account. One is what we call cyclical influences, or the cyclical current account, and two is what we call structural influences, or we can have a structural current account balance. Now, the reason we do this is that economists want to know, well, what's impacting the current account? Is this something that is going to be a long-term factor, or something that's more short-term that's likely to change? And they're just trying to get more information about what's going on with Australia's relationship and the rest of the world. So, what is the difference between structural and cyclical? Remember, we use these words to define types of unemployment as well. We actually use them to define types of budget outcomes when we get to budgetary policy. They all mean basically the same thing. So whenever you see structure or structural causes, it's broadly aggregate supply factors. And whenever you see cyclical causes, it's broadly aggregate demand factors or the business cycle. Cyclical relates to the cycle of a business, of an economy, sorry. Now, if we go a little bit deeper, structural causes are more persistent and they're more stable in the short term, so they're more long-term factors. So if I was to draw an Australia's current account balance, we could have here the cyclical balance, and it might not change very much. And if I change this, oh no, and the top here, this might be the cyclical. This moves up and down over the short term, just to give you a little visual there. Whoa, that's hard. So the structural balance doesn't really change in the short term, but the cyclical balance does. So in the short term, it's the cyclical causes which are driving changes in our current account balance from surplus to deficit or whatever. Okay, so let's apply these to a couple of examples. So cyclical factors, again, we're really thinking about aggregate demand factors here, short-term movements in the business cycle, which are going to impact the current account. So anytime there's a movement in overseas economic growth, this is going to impact exports up or down. It's going to impact credits on net goods and net services up or down, and this will impact the current account balance, right? So this is a cyclical factor. The third one down here is a movement in the terms of trade, which is the price of exports compared to the price of imports. Basically, we haven't actually got into this yet. But if, for instance, there was a change in the price of a key commodity for Australia, well, we'd receive more income into Australia, and that would lead to more credits on net goods, on the net goods sub account. If it was a service, it'd be net services. And vice versa, if prices of our key commodities went down or our key exports went down, we receive less credits. We also look at the price of imports, but I'll leave that for there now. And as I said before, any movement in aggregate demand is going to impact the business cycle. So if we have an expansion in the business cycle, that's going to be due to an increase in aggregate demand. And what that implies is that there is actually also an increase in import spending. Remember that all the components of aggregate demand have a percentage of import spending. So whenever there's an expansion in the business cycle, there's going to be more imports from overseas. And vice versa. If there was a contraction in the business cycle, if we were going downwards, well, there'd be a decrease in import spending because there was a decrease in aggregate demand. Okay, so there's some examples of cyclical factors, and you've just got to be able to identify. You might get asked to, using a cyclical factor, explain the impact on the current account. But that's all for now. So let's get into the structural factors. My jacket's just falling off my chair. There it goes. So structural factors are, again, anything that impacts the aggregate supply, the ability and willingness of businesses to produce, production costs, anything that impacts businesses, basically, productivity, all of which is going to affect our international competitiveness. So if we have some favorable movements in aggregate supply factors, maybe an improvement in productivity, a decrease in cost of production, maybe that's both due to an improvement or an increase in immigration levels, skilled immigration levels, well, that will increase Australia's international competitiveness. We'll be better able to compete with businesses overseas. And that will hopefully lead to an increase in export spending, which is a credit on net goods and net services. So it'll increase credits on the balance of trade, the trade balance or net goods and net services. And vice versa, if we had an unfavorable movement in one of these aggregate supply factors, maybe there was restrictions on immigration which drove up costs of production and decreases productivity, that would have the opposite impact. Okay. Now there's one final structural factor which is really important in Australia, or has been over the past. Basically, to fund the growth in the Australian economy. The Australian economy is growing very quickly, and we're also a very sort of stable political place to invest. We also didn't save enough money to fund our own growth, so that's the short way of saying we have a savings and investment imbalance. Basically, we haven't saved enough money to fund the investment that was required in Australia. So what happened is, because we're a politically stable country and quite an attractive place to invest, we received lots of money from overseas, which led to a much higher net foreign debt, but it also meant that we had to pay interest back on that debt. So again, this is a structural factor. It's pretty persistent and stable over the long term. We pay more debits as a result on our net primary income, and that pushes the current account towards a deficit or away from a surplus, depending on where you start. It worsens the current account balance or decreases the current account balance. Okay, hopefully that helps you to distinguish between structural and cyclical factors influencing the current account. Bye for now.